Well, thank you all for having me here today. It's great to come back to ASFPM. My first conference was, I remember it well, Milwaukee in 1998, and it's great to be here in Atlanta with such a wonderful theme, mitigation on my mind. How could I not come? Mitigation has been on the mind of this administration. The President, in his recent speeches at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and the National Hurricane Center, stressed the importance of mitigation. He has elevated the dialogue. Quote, "In fact, climate change, especially rising seas, is a threat to our homeland security, our economic infrastructure, and the safety and health of the American people." Nowhere is this more evident than in the Hampton Roads area. The White House is piloted with Captain Ray Toll, Old Dominion University, and the Center for Sea Level Rise. What they have done there is really a whole of government, whole of community approach, where they've had federal, state, local government working with the military and NASA and NOAA, a lot of our federal partners, and brought everyone to the table in really a bipartisan way to focus on climate change and sea level rise and what can be done to make the community more resilient, to make our federal facilities more resilient. It's been really a pleasure working with them, and their approach to preparedness and planning is something they hope to be used by other regions around the country. There's also a lot going on in the mitigation area that I think is of interest to ASFPM, and I'm sure a lot of you have read in the News and Views newsletters. One thing that we're working on right now is refreshing all of the National Preparedness System documents this year. That's under the Presidential Policy Directive number 8. That does include the National Preparedness Goal, and the National Mitigation Framework will be updated later this summer and fall. We are proud the President's budget this year did include increases in the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, an 8-fold increase from $25 to $200 million. Also, the risk map, the flood mapping funding, was also requested at $400 million. These are significant increases, and if approved by Congress, will provide states with substantially more funding and hazard mitigation information with which to reduce long-term vulnerabilities. But my main focus today is what I want to talk about, what a lot of you have been talking about in the sessions that I've attended here, is to discuss Executive Order 13690 and the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard. We have invested billions to help communities rebuild from Sandy. However, we also are committed to build back better, to rebuild infrastructure to a higher standard. We want to build it right the first time and not have to pay for it twice. The recent ASCE report, I think it just came out last week, titled Adapting Infrastructure and Civil Engineering Practice to Climate Change, it talks about, I encourage all of you to read it, it talks about the impacts of climate change in engineering practice and how we should consider them. We consider the long-term use of a building, so why shouldn't we include and consider the hazards that that building and infrastructure will face over its lifetime? More than 50% of Americans live in coastal counties, where key infrastructure and evacuation routes are increasingly vulnerable to impacts like sea level rise, storm surges, and flooding. According to the National Climate Assessment, which is just over a year old, version 3, more than $1 trillion of property and structures in the U.S. are at risk from inundation from sea level rise of 2 feet above the current level, an elevation that could be reached as early as 2050. So after Sandy, an interagency team initiated discussions with key stakeholders and technical experts to gather input on approaches to reduce public costs in future disasters. The President's Climate Action Plan called on federal agencies to update their federal risk reduction standards for federally funded projects to reflect a consistent approach that accounts for sea level rise and other factors. Additionally, the President's State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resilience deliberated on flood risk management and recommended that federal agencies adjust their practices in and around floodplains to ensure that federal assets be resilient, and that projects that receive federal funding be sited and designed with the best available data. So on January 30th of this year, the President signed Executive Order 13690, which amends Executive Order 11988 and establishes a federal flood risk management standard. After 38 years, it was about time. So what is the standard? The standard and the executive order ensure that agencies expand floodplain management for federal projects from the current base flood level to both a higher vertical elevation and corresponding horizontal floodplain. The new standard helps ensure that our taxpayer investments last as long as intended in the face of climate change. The standard closely tracks flood elevation requirements already adopted in at least 350 jurisdictions around the country. To date, more than 13,000 jurisdictions around the country have adopted codes with flood resilience provisions, including elevation of structures. The cost of meeting these requirements are projected to be minimal. As a lot of you are very well aware in the room, the expense of elevating a new structure during construction is generally low, between 0.25 and 1.5% of the total construction cost for each foot of added height. To make it clear, the flood standard will not prohibit building in the floodplain. Executive Order 11988 still applies. Rather, the standard requires that federally funded projects be resilient, whether through elevation or other floodproofing through design and construction methods. And it does have a number of exceptions, including exceptions for emergency actions, national security, and other mission-critical requirements. And the standard does encourage the use of natural features and nature-based approaches in the development of alternatives for federal actions. This approach, consistent with the restoration of natural systems and ecosystem processes where appropriate, recognizes the growing role of natural and restored systems that are engineered to mimic processes naturally, generally known as green infrastructure. I'm not going to go into the details of what has happened since January 30th. Roy's going to cover that in a lot of detail, but we are working through a lot of the comments, and the agency plans are due to us at the National Security Council on Friday. We are going to be working towards finalizing the implementing guidelines and then going through the process where agencies formally adopt the standard. And I think a lot of the questions that all of you are asking, how does it affect Program X and Program Y, please stay tuned, because that will come, but we first need to finalize the guidelines. But in closing, to push forward such an important executive order, I learned it takes a lot of hard work, compromise, and strong leadership from agency staff all the way up to the West Wing to pull off an effort. However, our job is not done yet. There's still a long push forward to help implement the standard. I do want to thank the team of experts from the departments and agencies who helped create the standard. All the working groups that helped spend a number of hours helping put together the standard and working through a lot of the issues, and we're working through a lot of the comments now, and I want to recognize their efforts. I do want to thank Roy Wright and his team for leading the 8 listening sessions and the webinar. They were fantastic, and leading the effort to adjudicate over the 1,500 comments that were received. I do want to thank personally both Rachel Sears and Rhonda Montgomery over here in the back for their hard work, helping get this through. Just unbelievable effort. I'd like to thank ASFPM for their leadership as well, and all of you in the room who participated in the listening sessions and submitted comments for the record. They will help us ensure that the final guidelines provide the best guidance to the agencies for implementing the standard. So we look forward to your continued engagement as we move through the implementing process. Thank you very much.